Today I put together some of the most savage bear attack stories I've covered on this channel so far. These stories include killer polar bears attacking students on a school trip, a man-eating grizzly bear on a 5-day rampage, and much more. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. These are some of the most disturbing bear attack stories you will ever hear. Welcome to Final Affliction. Yellowstone National Park is an American national park located in the western United States, largely in the northwest corner of Wyoming and extending into Montana and Idaho. Yellowstone is the first national park in the U.S. and is also widely held to be the first national park in the world. The park is known for its many geothermal features, especially the Old Faithful Geyser, one of its most popular. While it represents many types of biomes, the subalpine forest is the most abundant. It's also part of the South Central Rockies forest ecoregion, which spans an area of 3,468.4 square miles, comprising of lakes, canyons, rivers, and beautiful mountain ranges. Yellowstone Lake is one of the largest high-elevation lakes in North America and is centered over the Yellowstone caldera, the largest supervolcano on the continent. It's erupted with tremendous force several times in the last 2 million years and is overdue to explode again soon. Grizzly bears, wolves, and free-ranging herds of bison and elk live in this park. It's safe to say Yellowstone National Park is a dangerous place to be, and with numerous recreational opportunities including hiking, camping, boating, fishing, and sightseeing attracting nearly 5 million visitors each year. It's no surprise that it's seen its fair share of tragic deaths. On April 15, 2021, Charles Mock, who was 40 years old at the time, set out into the park to do some fishing in the place he loved most, Yellowstone National Park. Charles was always an avid lover of the outdoors ever since early childhood, but out of all places in the world, he fell in love with Yellowstone. When he turned 30, he moved there permanently just so he could spend every bit of spare time he had in the park. The overwhelming sense of peace and happiness he experienced in the rugged remoteness of the park was so much that he soon sought out work inside the park. Charles wanted to spend every waking second of the day in Yellowstone, and finally got his wish when he landed a job as a tour guide for backcountry adventure. Charles wanted to catch some trout at his favorite fishing spot at the Madison River, deep in the wilderness of Yellowstone. He was aware of the risks and dangers that come with venturing this far into the wild, but had been fishing all week without any problems. It's well known that the presence of grizzly bears is an everlasting threat to the lives of all fishermen, hunters, hikers, campers, and even to area workers. Anyone venturing into the wilderness here is advised to carry some form of self-protection, and Charles knew this. He always made sure to keep his pistol and bear spray with him just in case he ever had to use it. But after a week straight of fishing, he felt safe enough to leave his pistol at home and only bring with him his bear spray. Charles arrived at the river and began unpacking his equipment from his truck. He gathered his fishing pole, camera, and supplies and began soaking in the peace that he always felt here. He also brought along his tackle box full of other important items and began his half-mile hike down the trail towards the water. As always, he kept a wary eye out during the walk for the number of dangerous animals in the area. Bison, grizzly bears, and even moose have been involved in attack on humans in the prior years, and that was the last thing Charles wanted to come across alone in the wilderness. He'd had his fair share of bear encounters throughout the years. Charles and his friend Riley had numerous run-ins with grizzlies who had even bluff charged them several times to intimidate them, but luckily they were always just warnings to scare off the men, who thankfully were never actually attacked, but a terrifying experience nonetheless. As Charles walked along the riverbank looking for a good spot to dip his line and snapping photos of the beautiful scenery, he unknowingly walked into one of the most dangerous situations he could have found: a large moose carcass that looked to be half-eaten by a grizzly bear. What Charles failed to realize was that the bear who claimed this food source had already been fighting to defend its food to the point of killing and partially eating another grizzly, and was still enraged and irritated from the event and watching in the distance. Charles froze as soon as he realized what he was walking towards and quietly scanned the tree line while listening carefully for any signs of the bear. He slowly began backing up the way he came, being careful not to turn his back to the carcass, knowing that if the grizzly was watching, he would more than likely attack him while his back was turned. All of a sudden, Charles hears a loud woof sound he recognizes as a bear, which sends shivers down his spine. He immediately stopped in his tracks and surveyed the area around him for the upset bear, while simultaneously pulling out his bear spray as a precaution, and prepared for what is typically a very tense standoff. As he searched the brush for the bear, the forest turned eerily silent for a few seconds before all of a sudden it came charging towards him with his head low and ears pinned back in the typical way an enraged bear moves while on the attack. Charles prayed that it was just another bluff charge, but as the bear ran closer, it didn't veer off or slow down. Time stood still for Charles as he watched as the bear's eyes focused slowly on him as it came rocketing in his direction. The bear closed the last 100 feet of distance with blinding speed as Charles unloaded his bear spray at the grizzly. The orange cloud of bear spray engulfed the bear, but it seemed to have done nothing but make the bear more angry as it quickly tackled and knocked Charles to the ground. The 700-pound bear pinned Charles to the ground and focused its attack on Charles' head and neck, swiping its massive claws through Charles' flesh while its powerful jaws carved grooves into his skull. The bear seemed to be targeting its attack on Charles' head, continuously biting and swiping at his scalp, removing significant portions of flesh in the process. It then bit into his neck, tearing flesh and crucial arteries from his body as blood started to spray onto the bear and forest around him. Charles desperately raised his hands over his head and neck as a shield, but the bear clamped down on them and crushed them into useless lumps of bleeding flesh. Then the bear went in for the kill. It gripped Charles' head in its mouth and squeezed down in an attempt to crush his skull, but only managed to penetrate one of its canine teeth fully through the skull. Now, with a 2-inch hole through Charles' skull, his hands mangled and crippled and the scalp torn to shreds, the bear stopped the attack and went back to the moose carcass just a few 100 feet away. Charles was now laying unconscious in a pool of his own blood, barely hanging on to life. He gained consciousness about 10 minutes later, and despite his condition, he was determined to get to an area to reach out for help. He tried crawling, but the pain was so overwhelming he was unable to move. Charles managed to prop himself in an upright position against a tree stump, where he slowly searched his supplies with his only useful hand to find a cell phone to call for help. He dialed 911 and his call was picked up and emergency responders were immediately dispatched. Charles remained on the phone with 911 for nearly an hour, directing the officers to his location somewhere deep in Yellowstone National Park. When they finally found him, he was still clutching his bear spray can in his functioning hand despite it being completely emptied onto the bear previously. He was stabilized as best they could at the scene and immediately transported to the Eastern Idaho Emergency Medical Center in Idaho Falls for life-saving emergency medical support. The next day, as Carl and the medical team fought for his life, Montana game wardens approached the area. They made a lot of noise and were very clear in their efforts to run the bear off so they could complete their investigation into the attack. The bear had other plans though, and as they approached it, it emerged from the cover in the same threatening manner as it addressed Charles, head low and ears pinned back in clear signs of aggression. The wardens fired off special rounds that cracked and pop in an attempt to persuade the bear to back off, but it failed. As the bear powered towards the 7 volunteers and their dog, it got bogged down in some deep snow, temporarily slowing its attack. The bear quickly regained its traction and continued its advance towards the group. The bear closed in within 40 feet of the men before they discharged lethal rounds and dropped the bear. As its blood seeped into the soil, its rage and aggression seemed to dissipate as it stopped all movement. The wardens performed a necropsy on the bear's carcass and investigated the attack scene. On Charles' clothes, they had previously noted the contents of his bear spray can. As they examined the bear, the same was found on the bear's fur, meaning that Charles had in fact discharged his bear spray successfully. Once the bear had been cut open and the contents of its guts analyzed, the wardens determined that the bear had been feeding on the moose it was defending that found tissues from at least one other grizzly bear, confirming the grizzly was previously fighting off other bears from its meal, and most likely why he was so aggressive towards Charles and the wardens. Back at the medical center, Charles had 2 surgical procedures in an attempt to save him. According to doctors, the surgeries went well, but within a few days, Charles suffered a severe stroke and died from the trauma inflicted during the bear attack. West Yellowstone organized a memorial service at the Union Pacific Dining Lodge in town, and his family held a private ceremony in commemoration of Charles. 2 nights after Charles was mauled, the town of West Yellowstone had a bear visit them. The locals point out that the bears are so numerous that they can hardly avoid run-ins with them. The greater Yellowstone area, which spans portions of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, is reported to have more than 700 grizzly bears. Fatal attacks have increased in recent decades as the bears recover from threatened status, as well as humans moving into more remote areas than ever before. Since 2010, grizzlies have killed 8 people. However, grizzlies are still under federal protection in areas outside of Alaska, although recent discussions have begged review of that status, fearing that as long as grizzlies remain protected, their numbers will continue to rise, increasing the chances of more innocent people unfortunately meeting their final affliction. On May 14, 1978, 4 boys between the ages of 12 and 18 had gone out for a relaxing day of fishing in the Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. 18-year-old Richard Rindress and his younger brother William had invited 12-year-old George Halfkenny along with his 14-year-old brother Mark to practice fishing in the Radiant Lake in northeastern Ontario. It was a calm lake surrounded by pristine wilderness and thick forest. The water hosted trout, bass, and a variety of smallmouth fish. The wider park had several species of mammals including moose, deer, and beavers. But among the trees lurked a predator. The famed black bear was known to inhabit the deeper forest, but seldom had encounters with humans. The large furry mammal could weigh over 450 pounds and stand taller than an average human on 2 feet. However, they weren't known to be aggressive unless provoked and usually kept themselves deep among the forest wildlife. It was early summer in Canada, and the warm heat of the sun had created an ideal fishing escape among the trees, and the fish were plentiful. The boys parked their car near the Radiant Lake and ventured off for a catch. It was a serene experience for the young boys, as the summer sun heated the once frozen trees and lakes, making the hungry fish resurface to take the baits. The entire day went by, and the boys were ecstatic with their catch. A few hours later, the sky started to dim as sunlight faded and evening set in. Unknown to them, an apex predator's eyes had been locked on them from among the dense trees. A hungry black bear had ventured too close near the lake where the boys had been fishing. The dark forest, aided by the dimming sunlight, helped the black bear camouflage itself in the background. The ambushed predator stalked the boys along the trees and was aided by the silent crunch of the cold, wet leaves that littered the forest floor. As dark set in, the four boys headed back to their car to sort out their catch before leaving. Parked a few hundred meters from the lake, the young boys were prepared to drive away. George Hafkany, tempted by the good catch throughout the day, decided to give it one more try before the sky went completely dark. He decided to walk to the lake alone after telling the other boys he would be back in a few minutes. He cast his hook one last time into the clear waters, hoping to catch a big one to take home. But by this time, 12-year-old George Hafkany had become an object of interest for the giant black bear lying in wait among the trees. Caught alone and unable to defend himself, George was quietly ambushed from behind by the forest predator. As it stood on its two hind legs and slammed its feet onto the young boy's fragile torso, George could only let out a light squeal, unheard by any one of his friends, before being dragged away by the massive bear. He died a quick death, but his final moments were in terror and pain, as the bear towered over the young boy before breaking his neck using its body weight. A few minutes passed and George had still not returned. The boys had been waiting for him and wanted to leave before night set in. They called his name from afar into the dark, empty forest, but there was no response. Something was eerily wrong, and every passing minute made them concerned for George's safety. William and Mark finally decided to walk to the edge of the lakeshore and look for George, but there was no sign of him. But unbeknownst to them, their cries and calls for their friend were heard by something else. The predatory black bear had been alerted by the sounds and decided to leave George's body in the woods to come back for more, this time for William and Mark. The boys were now worried and trembling from the fear and cold. This is when they made the fatal mistake of going deeper into the trees to look for him. Walking among the bush trail in tight forest, Mark separated from William, trying to find his lost brother. The bear appeared from between the trees, and Mark quickly found himself jumped by a mass of black fur. The bear ended his life in a similar fashion, breaking his neck with its body weight before dragging him away into the forest. The little boy could offer little resistance and died a quick death. The area once again fell silent, and William realized something was terribly wrong. His heart started racing, and he let out cries of help, calling on his friend and brother. The bear now had 2 dead bodies, but was not done with the hunt. William was alone. He was now deep in the predator's area, hopelessly lost and vulnerable. 16-year-old William was terrified out of his senses and tried running to safety among the confusing maze of forest trees. The giant black bear again started chasing him, stealthily following his voice and scent. A brief chase, and William was ambushed from behind by the black bear in a similar way it had killed Mark and George. The frail young boy was no match for the bear's massive weight, its sharp claws or biting teeth. He succumbed to the attack in a few seconds and became an addition to the pile of dead bodies that the bear had been collecting after dragging them into the forest. 18-year-old Richard Rindress awaited the return of the other 3 boys and was left puzzled by the sudden silence that befell the scene after their calls for George could no longer be heard. The boys seemed to disappear one after another in an eerie fashion, with no idea of what happened to them. Reluctantly, he walked further a few meters close to the shoreline in hopes of finding a sign of his brother and friends, but to no avail. He noticed only a dropped fishing pole beside the water, surrounded by a thick forest. It was the dark of night, and Richard was too unnerved to dare venture deeper into the woods for fear of meeting a similar fate as the other boys. He hastily ran back to the car to go and find help from local residents and authorities to locate his friends. A search party was organized, and several armed men spread into the forest trying to find the missing young boys. A few hours later, the bodies of George, Mark, and William were finally found found huddled close to one another. They were still uneaten, but piled together by the bear in a cynical fashion. A few feet away in the bushes, a large black bear was spotted guarding its kill. The boys had all been killed in a similar way, with a quick snap of the neck with the massive weight of the black bear stomping with its front legs. It was a terrifying sight, and left researchers perplexed why the bear had carried out this predatory attack and not consumed any of the bodies of the young boys. It was thought that the bear may have been tempted by the smell of the dead trout that George had been carrying in his pocket, but could not find it. The young boys had planned their fishing trip at the last time they should have, in the new summer heat when the black bears were more likely to come closer out of the forest to search the lakes for fish. The 275-pound black bear was shot dead by the authorities, but the news of the brutal demise of the 3 young boys sent shockwaves across Canada and devastated their parents and families beyond consolation. No one expected a killer black bear to be roaming the forest, stalking the 3 young boys and leading them to their final affliction. Polar bears are known to be one of the most fearsome predators in the natural world. You've probably all heard this advice when coming across a bear. If it's brown, lay down. If it's black, fight back. And if it's white, good night. Luckily, polar bear attacks are very rare and there have only been a few recorded fatalities. Despite this, the number of bear attacks worldwide have gradually increased over the last couple of decades because of increased food scarcity and habitat destruction, which is forcing these animals to leave their natural environment and encroach onto human territory in search of food. What little habitat these animals have left is often used for hunting and hiking by humans, leaving them with very few places to go, and the likelihood of encountering someone increases. While brown bears have always been the main perpetrators of these bear attacks in North America, there is an alarming trend growing as polar bear attacks are on the rise. Aaron Gibbons was 31 years old in 2018 and was considered to be an incredibly experienced and talented hunter. He was a family man, someone who put his 3 children above all else and kept them safe no matter what. He lived in RV at Nunavut, an area known to be very remote, suffering incredibly cold temperatures throughout the winter, which means that the community must help each other out if they are going to survive this season. Aaron regularly used his hunting skills for the good of his community, selflessly providing meat for those in need. Aside from the cold, the area shared its land with an apex predator, the polar bear. Despite the close proximity, there had not been an attack in the area for 18 years, and the indigenous people knew to leave the animals alone, creating an understanding between the bears and the people of mutual respect and solitude. Naturally, there had been encounters regardless, and so a patrol had been set up on the outskirts of town to protect the inhabitants and redirect any bears who got too close to the settlement. Aside from a few interactions, there was a relative harmony between the people and the bears. On July 3rd, Aaron decided to visit Century Island with his children to take them fishing and spend some quality time with them. The island was around 10 miles away from their home by boat and was a regular fishing spot for locals and tourists alike, particularly as it was a hot spot for beluga whales. The family planned on gathering some bird eggs on the island, and as soon as they landed on the island, the children ran off the boat, excited to spend time with their dad for the day. He briefed them on the do's and don'ts of their activity to make sure they would be as safe as possible, but he didn't foresee any issues for the day as it was a fairly standard procedure and he just wanted his kids to have fun on their day together. After explaining some of the dangers, the children headed off to collect their eggs. Aaron was proud to see how excited they were and was ready to slowly teach them everything he knew so that they could grow up protected by his knowledge. While watching the children, he spotted something in the distance, and the longer he stared at it, the colder his blood turned. A polar bear was slowly stalking his youngest daughter, creeping closer and closer to where she was searching. The bear's ears were facing backwards, signaling to Aaron that the bear considered his daughter to be prey and he knew that there was no way that she would win the fight against the bear. At this time, she was completely unaware, assessing a nearby bird's nest to see which egg she could take back to her dad. Aaron shouted to his children, telling them to run to the boat as fast as they could. He sprinted towards them, trying to get between the bear and the children, but as he ran, he realized he left his rifle on the boat and so was currently running towards a hunting polar bear with no protection but his bare hands. He began grabbing rocks instead, hurling them at the animal in an attempt to distract it or scare it away from his children. Aaron was so desperate he would do anything he could to save his children. Suddenly, a few of his rock throws hit the animal. Confused, it stops tracking the children. He was so thankful that his children were no longer in the animal's eye line that it took him a second to realize that all of the bear's attention was now fixed on him instead, and he was completely unarmed. He shouted to his eldest daughter on the boat, telling her to call for help on the radio and continue to try to throw rocks at the bear to scare it off. Quickly, Aaron realized that this wouldn't work as the bear continued to approach him and decided to break all the rules. He turned his back on the animal and ran for the boat. He could hear the bear behind him and knew that it was going to be much faster than him. He just needed to get close enough to the boat so that his daughter could throw him the rifle. It was his only chance. He ran along the shore, praying that he would be able to make it back to his children in time. Unfortunately, polar bears run at 40 kilometers an hour, and so it was impossible for him to outrun the bear. He looked at his children one last time and was pulled to the ground as the bear leapt onto him from behind. The animal grabbed him by the neck and began throwing him from side to side, the strength of the bear making Aaron seem like a rag doll in its grip. The pain must have been excruciating as his body was thrown into the rocks and the ice beneath them as his children were forced to watch. When Aaron finally stopped moving, the bear climbed upon him and began to eat him, finally ending the life of Aaron Gibbons. The children were traumatized and begged for someone to come and help them over the radio. They hid in the boat, listening to sounds of their father being devoured by the predator. But their prayers were soon answered, as an emergency team arrived and took the children away before shooting and killing the polar bear. Aaron's body was half-eaten at this point, and so he was taken back to his family and community in Arviat instead of the hospital. Everyone was devastated by the loss. He was an important part of the community and well-liked by all. His sacrifice was not in vain as he saved his 3 children despite losing his own life. 2 years later, his bravery was recognized in a Canadian ceremony by the Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief of Canada, Julie Payette. He received the Star of Courage for the defense of his children, and although he was not alive to receive it, his family were able to keep it as a physical reminder of the courage of Aaron, who was truly a hero to his family before ultimately meeting his final affliction. Today's story not only displays the overwhelming strength of the American black bear, but also shows how swiftly humans can fall off the top of the food chain when throwing caution to the wind or when in the wrong circumstance. This story takes place in Woe Mountain, Colorado, located in Isabel National Forest. This area not only features stunning natural scenery and breathtaking arrangements of gorgeous green landscapes, but it's also home to a thriving and diverse ecosystem of animals such as mule deer, elk, bighorn sheep, mountain goats, and wild turkeys, the population of which are kept in check by fierce predatory animals such as mountain lions and, of course, the dangerous and highly resourceful American black bear. The American black bear is a truly fascinating and frightening creature. Black bears are easily distinguishable by their blackish fur. These creatures can grow up to 6 feet long and weigh 600 pounds on average. However, some American black bears get as big as as 900 pounds. Even though they aren't the biggest animals out there, black bears make up for it in speed and agility. Black bears are normally quite fast, running at speeds up to 30 miles an hour. In short bursts, they can even reach a speed of 35 miles per hour. Additionally, black bears are excellent climbers and can easily scale trees, something grizzly bears have difficulty doing and polar bears cannot do at all. Though black bears are smaller and not as strong as grizzly bears, their physical prowess is still quite impressive. They can easily flip a 325-pound rock with one paw, and they're not only very dexterous but also quite resourceful. In fact, they're even known for being able to open door latches and climb over steel gates. The average American black bear has a bite force of around 800 psi. Although this is weaker than the grizzly bear, it's about 2 times stronger than the bite force of a male mountain lion. Not only are black bears incredibly strong, but their teeth can grow up to 2.5 inches long. Combined with their razor-sharp claws, their teeth, and their powerful bite, black bears are without question highly dangerous animals. They can swing their claws at a force of 980 pounds, which is almost 7 times stronger than the average man, and more than enough to kill you with a single swipe. 24-year-old Colin McClelland was a lumberjack. His job entailed camping out in the open wilderness as he chopped up trees and harvested timber. This job inevitably put him at risk of encountering the plethora of predatory wildlife the mountain was so famous for, including black bears. The outdoors ran in Colin's family. His father was a licensed outfitter in Colorado for 13 years, so it only made sense that Colin would follow in his footsteps. For several years, he had been setting up camp on Woe Mountain to harvest timber from the nearby timber stands, but lately he'd been having more and more bear problems. 3 years prior to the horrific incident that occurred, he even called the Colorado Division of Wildlife when a bear broke into his camper and ate all of his food. In fact, Colin's father, who was a lumberjack, once had a black bear sneak up on him as he slept and licked insect repellent off his face. At first, the black bears were scared of Colin, but as the years went by and as he frequented his logging camps more and more, they soon began to grow worryingly used to his presence. Inevitably, Colin would have multiple encounters with black bears. It even got to a point where he asked local authorities for help, but sadly, his complaints were either brushed aside or ignored, and a year later, a horrible tragedy would befall him. Most black bear attacks are not territorial in nature. Rather, male black bears go on the hunt to fatten up in preparation for the long and arduous hibernation. Bears who are desperate enough will eat whatever is available to them, whether it be rodents, insects, or berries. Even humans aren't off the menu for these opportunistic animals. If you ever find yourself in a situation being attacked by a black bear, it's important to always remember that your only chance of survival is to fight back. Attempting to run away, more often than not, results in being tackled and pinned to the ground by the faster and much more agile bear. Try your best to focus your punches and kicks on its eyes, ears, and snout, and pray that it isn't desperate enough as to ignore the risks of injuries in favor of a potential meal. Black bears that find food without being scared away may come back for more, desensitizing themselves to humans in the process. If this occurs frequently enough, it can lead to conflicts, particularly during hyperphagia, a late summer feeding frenzy where bears try to consume 20,000 calories a day in preparation for hibernation. Bears who lose fear of humans are also called nuisance bears. These nuisance bears often include sub-adult male bears who have recently left their mothers and still need to learn how to find food. Additionally, female bears with young cubs also fall into this category. In many states, once a bear is identified as a nuisance bear, that bear is killed or relocated far away in an effort to prevent the bear from returning. Unlike most bear attack victims, who are for the most part inexperienced or ignorant of the bear's behavior, Colin knew perfectly well what draws this ferocious beast. He spared no effort in hiding any crumbs or pieces of food lying around his camp, storing them far away to ensure no unwanted visitors come prowling about in the middle of the night in search of a meal. He even carried around his trusty rifle, which he hoped, if push comes to shove, would prove a valuable asset that could save his life. Colin wasn't feeling all that well in the days prior and was taking some potent flu medications in order to recover. Cutting down pine trees is exhausting work, but being sick on top of that made it even harder. To make matters worse, Colin has had to sleep on the roof of his RV as black bears had become increasingly aggressive and would attempt to break into his van in search of food on several occasions. On the fateful night of August 13, 1993, Colin was feeling particularly sick. He couldn't stomach the idea of spending yet another night on the roof of his RV out in the cold, and so, against his better judgment, he decided he would spend the night inside his RV. Unfortunately, the scent of the meal he had prepared before going to sleep had caught the attention of a black bear that was nearby. This particular black bear was different. It was almost hibernation season, and the 240-pound bear was starving because it had little luck bulking up in preparation for the winter. This not only made it desperate, but also made it highly aggressive and willing to take risks most black bears would shy away from. Finally, the bear arrived at Colin's camp. Wasting no time, it quickly began rummaging and sniffing around in search of the alluring aroma which had caught its attention. Eventually, it came to realize that the scent it had picked up was seeping from Colin's RV. The beast spared no effort, immediately lunging at the RV's door and beginning to claw and smash against it. Colin was jolted awake, only to see that the only barrier keeping him safe was being torn to shreds as it bent under the overwhelming force of the bear's mighty claws. He knew that the door wouldn't keep the bear at bay for very long, and so he reached for his rifle and fired from inside, hoping to hit the bear and scare it off before it inevitably broke inside. Unfortunately, this had the exact opposite effect, as it only served to further anger the bear, which now began pushing against the RV's door at a much more violent and rapid rate. Colin stood frozen in shock when the door was suddenly knocked open, completely unable to come up with an idea that would save him. The bear's terrifying gaze briefly met Colin's only for a split second before the violent and starving animal suddenly bounced, instantly beginning its assault by viciously and savagely clawing at helpless Colin, who was in no shape to ward off his attacker. But even if he was, it was unlikely a healthy, full-grown male could withstand an onslaught even from a smaller and malnourished black bear. And so, as Colin did what little he could do to fight off his attacker, his body finally gave up fighting as it crumbled onto the ground beneath the weight of the mighty bear. As Colin sat there, likely screaming in excruciating amounts of pain, the bear gave him no chance of recuperating as it quickly delivered a bite so powerful it shattered Colin's skull, quickly and brutally ending his life. Colin McClelland was dead, but the tragedy was far from over. When Colin's friends and loved ones went up to check on him as they knew he was feeling sick these past few days, they were devastated by the horror they witnessed. Colin's was now an amalgamation of clumps of flesh and torn tissue held together by little more than fragments of broken bone. Upon further investigation, authorities concluded that Colin's body was consumed in small increments, as the culprit likely returned to feast upon Colin's remains no less than 3 times. Efforts were made to find the bear responsible for Colin's death. Eventually, a bear with a bullet wound matching that of the caliber used by Colin's rifle was subdued and later put down. Upon further examination, however, it was determined that this bear was in fact not the one responsible for Colin's death, as no traces of Colin's remains were ever found inside the bear's body. Humans must take every necessary precaution to protect themselves when camping out in the open. Wild animals such as black bears might seem docile, but they are still dangerous predators that should be respected and treated with caution. Colin's story is a tragic reminder of what can happen when we let our guard down and fail to take the necessary precautions. We must always be aware of our surroundings and take steps to ensure our safety, especially when entering the territory of fearsome predators such as bears. Nevertheless, while we can't save the ones we have lost, we can always aspire to protect the ones we haven't, and hopefully spare them the unimaginable horror of witnessing their final affliction. In one of the world's most northwestern areas, in between Norway and the North Pole, you would find a cluster of small islands known as Svalbard. Although conditions are very harsh and the landscape desolate, you can still find about 2,500 people living on Svalbard, fighting with the elements every day. If the freezing temperatures and frequent snowstorms were not enough to contend with, the residents are also outnumbered by one of the deadliest predators in the world, the polar bear. There are frequent bear attacks as the animals search for food, and frequent deaths as a result for both people and the polar bears. Despite these risks, Svalbard is known for having a beautiful variety of Arctic wildlife, some that can only be seen on Svalbard itself. Tourists come to the area to see Svalbard reindeers, Arctic foxes, walruses, and a number of seal and whale species. Many also come to specifically see the polar bears, as their numbers are still decreasing, so many believe it may be their last chance to see this amazing animal in the wild. However, extra care must be taken around these animals, or the worst might happen. Horatio Chappelle was just 17 years old in 2011 when he visited Svalbard with the British Schools Exploring Society for an adventure holiday. His parents were concerned about the possibility of bear attacks, but were told that many safety precautions were in place, and so they relented and allowed him to go. He was described as inquisitive, hardworking, and determined, and was well liked by his peers. He had a passion for medicine and was expected to become a brilliant doctor. However, this trip would change everything, and unfortunately, Horatio would not be able to fulfill his dreams. The group arrived in Svalbard on July 23, 2011, which consisted of 80 people in total, including adults and teenagers. The trip was supposed to be over a month long, with long hikes and cramped tents, but memories for a lifetime. The group was very excited for the expedition and to begin exploring. 2 weeks had passed and they were halfway through their trip. Everyone was now firm friends and they bonded over the hardships of their experiences. Horatio was having an amazing trip, and on August 5th, he went to sleep in his tent, feeling excited about what the next day would hold. Earlier that day, the group had seen some polar bear footprints, but as the animal was common in this area, there was no immediate concern, and they were simply amazed to see any sign of the bears. Unfortunately, that night, the camp would be attacked by a starving male bear, and Horatio would be killed. That night, Horatio was sharing his tent with 2 other friends, Scott Bennell Smith, 16, and Patrick Flinders, 17. At around 7:30 a.m., Scott was suddenly awoken by the tent shaking. He thought he was being shaken awake by someone when suddenly, the tent was ripped apart by a skinny male polar bear. It was clear that he hadn't eaten for some time, which many believed fueled the bear's aggression toward the group. As the bear struck out, he hit both Scott and Patrick, who sustained head and back injuries. Patrick, who had survived the terrifying attack but was left with horrifying facial scars, later recalled what happened that night. While sleeping in his tent, he was woke up from the tent being shaken violently. Within seconds, the tent collapsed down on him and his friends with great force. By the time he lifted the collapsed tent's fabric away from his face, an aggressive polar bear began swiping and snapping at his face. Its claws were huge and sliced through his skin effortlessly. The blood around its mouth and nose were easy to see because of its white fur, and at this moment, Patrick thought he was going to die. Patrick threw his arms in front of his face to protect himself from the attack when suddenly, he felt the bear's teeth clamp down around his elbow and the bear forcing his arm away from his face before biting down on his skull. "I could hear it crack," he said, and then I heard a growl which was deafening because I was so up close. In a last-ditch effort to save himself from being devoured by the bear, he punched the bear repeatedly in the face until it miraculously let him go and set its sights on Horatio. Matthew Burke was in another tent, but he awoke by the screams of his friends as they shouted to alert the camp of the bear. He saw Horatio being dragged along the snow. The bear had a firm grip upon his head, and when it let go, it reared up and slammed itself down onto Horatio's body. It's thought that if he hadn't been killed by the severe head injury that had already occurred, this was the moment Horatio sadly passed away. The group panicked and the noise woke one of the adults, Michael Reed, 29. He grabbed a rifle and left the tent, aimed to save the young man. He lined up the shot, cocked the rifle, and fired, but the bullets fell to the ground. He tried to fire more rounds, but the rifle was not working. Now, the bear had his sights on Michael. Fear filled his body as he realized that this bear would try to eat him, while he had nothing to defend himself with. The bear was quickly upon him, and he felt the animal's teeth sink into his head. The pain was indescribable, but he had to focus if he was going to survive. From his training, he knew that the weakest part of the polar bear would be its eyes, and so attempted to gouge them in an attempt to escape. But the bear was unfazed and continued to maul him. The mountain leader, Andrew Ruck, 27, then charged at the bear. He shouted and threw rocks, but then the bear turned on him too. He was knocked to the ground and the bear was on top of him, swiping at his head. He stared at the bear, thinking that this would be his last moment on Earth, and just praying that he would be able to escape. Fortunately, his prayers were answered. Once Michael had escaped, he was able to grab the rifle, reload it, and with a massive bang, he shot the bear dead. They were safe, and he had survived an attack from one of the deadliest animals in the world. How did this incident even happen? Why was a young man killed when his parents were assured that there was no danger to their son? All of the group were supposed to be given pen flares, as well as tripwires around the camp to alert them of nearby bears. After an inquest, it came to light that this was not actually the case. It was revealed that only the team leaders have these devices, not all members of the group. This was a critical issue, as if Horatio or any other member of this group had these devices, they would have been able to fire them at the bear and would potentially have avoided death. The team leader explained that while it was their plan to give everyone a pen flare, they realized that once they got to the base camp, they had not packed enough, a fatal mistake. But how did the bear get this close in the first place? The tripwire surrounding the camp was meant to alert the group of approaching animals with a large bang from the firing of the device. There are usually 4 devices set up around a camp, using corner paths attached to fine fishing line which would act as a tripwire. The first issue arose when the group had to use 3 devices instead and made a triangular campsite. The fishing line had been exchanged for fluorescent cord to avoid false firing, and the devices themselves were not complete, as there was a shortage of triggers. Ultimately, the protections set up around the camp were not enough, and the devices did not fire when they were most needed. In addition, due to the presence of the tripwires, leaders believed it was safe enough to not organize a bear watch, meaning everyone simply went to bed rather than to watch out for bears. The last issue is the rifle that was used. There was only 1 rifle taken on this trip, and it misfired several times, which caused 2 more members of the group to be attacked by the bear. The rifle in question was a Moser 98K rifle, which dated back to the Second World War. It was improperly stored and handled, and the training of the team was extremely limited, which was the final fatal mistake. After the team returned home and Horatio's body was returned to his family, the inquest found that BSES did not act criminally negligible under criminal law, but admitted that this death was caused by a number of unfortunate circumstances. His parents tried to appeal this decision, but Norwegian prosecutors also agreed that no criminal charges could be brought. Instead, to help the family grieve, they set up a charity in Horatio's name called Horatio's Garden. When he was alive, he would volunteer at Salisbury Spinal Center and suggested that a garden should be created away from the wards, giving the patients and their families somewhere beautiful to visit. There are currently 8 of these gardens across the UK, and in 2019, HRH Princess Eugene became a royal patron of the charity. Even in death, Horatio has been able to change the lives of countless patients and their families. Grizzly bears are one of nature's most terrifying apex predators. They're one of the largest bear species and are normally found in the northwest United States and western Canada. The average male grizzly bear can be up to 6.5 feet tall. Some grizzlies, however, have been known to reach heights of up to 9 feet and weigh as much as 1,000 pounds. Grizzly bears possess long, sharp claws that can be up to 4 inches long. They also have very powerful jaws, and their bite force is one of the strongest when it comes to mammals. A grizzly bear's powerful bite can crush a human skull with ease. Its sharp claws can easily puncture and slice human flesh, and its razor-sharp teeth can cut through muscle and bone. In addition to their deadly claws and teeth, grizzly bears are also known for their volatile tempers, and they can be extremely dangerous, especially when threatened. Despite their size, strength, and short temper, grizzly bears are generally shy and reclusive animals. They will usually avoid contact with humans if possible. However, grizzly bears have been known to occasionally attack humans, especially if they feel threatened or when protecting their young. If you encounter a grizzly bear, it's important to stay calm and avoid making any sudden movements. Try to back away slowly and make yourself as big as possible. Whatever you do, do not run, as this may trigger the bear's predatory instincts to give chase. This is the tragic story of Leah Loken, the story of a strong and fearless woman who had an ill-fated encounter with this ferocious predator. Leah Davis Loken was born on December 16, 1955 in Corona del Mar, California. She enjoyed a childhood spent horseback riding and exploring the outdoors near her home in Laguna Beach. After many years of working as a registered nurse specializing in surgery recovery, Leah moved to California and built a home for herself in 2016. Leah's horrifying tragedy began on July 6, 2021. Leah and her sister had arrived the day before at a small town called Ovando, situated in Montana. They were taking part in an ultra-endurance cycling event that ran from Banff, Canada to New Mexico, a journey of nearly 4,000 kilometers. Leah was a competitive cyclist who took part in mountain bike races. She never let her age weigh her down, and she even won the Mammoth National Champion Enduro race in July 2015 at 59 years old. In recent years, Montana's population of grizzly bears was expanded into new areas where people now live and visit. Consequently, interactions between grizzly bears and humans have becoming more frequent in the northern Rockies. It got so worrying that requests were even submitted to lift the restrictions preventing the killing of dangerous wild animals such as bears, not only in Montana, but also in the adjacent states of Wyoming and Idaho. Upon arriving at Ovando, Leah immediately wanted to go camping outdoors. She had even found a perfect spot behind a nearby museum where she could get a phenomenal view of the beautiful night sky. Her sister and friends weren't too keen on her plans, however, as they had heard reports of a wild bear roaming nearby. Her sister pleaded with her to ditch the risky idea and stay with her at a hotel, but Leah was too stubborn to heed her sister's warnings. She set up camp next to the Blackfoot River, failing to take into consideration that it bordered a forest where more than 1,000 grizzly bears roamed free. Despite the obvious risks, Leah felt relatively safe as she had not only brought with her a full can of bear spray, but she also met Texas couple Kim and Joe Cole, who shared her love for camping and erected their tent close by to hers, giving her a false sense of security. At 3 a.m., Leah was fast asleep when a hulking shadow appeared before her tent. Leah woke up at the sound of snuffling coming from nearby. She wasn't sure what it was, but it sounded big. The mysterious figure soon approached her tent, shrouding it in darkness with its shadow as it began sniffing where her head was located from outside. Leah soon realized what the figure was and began screaming for help. Kim and Joe woke up to her screams and began shouting as well. The combined noise made by this trio was luckily enough to scare the bear away, as it soon retreated back into the darkness. After making sure the bear was gone, the couple ran to Leia's side to check up on her. She assured them she was fine, and they suggested it may be for the best of Leia to pack up her things and spend the rest of the night at a hotel for her own safety.
Officers said the food-conditioned bear showed no fear of humans and repeatedly ripped open coolers and pushed on tents in search of food.
Leia told the couple that the bear appeared to be looking around for something and that it even huffed at her head. Apparently, that grizzly was food-conditioned. Grizzlies that are food-conditioned have learned to seek out human food, which makes them highly dangerous as they no longer fear humans, and more often than not, associate humans with a potential meal when they see them. This is why it's important not to store any food in your tent when camping in an area where grizzly bears are known to roam, as it will only bring them closer to you. This made Leia think that by distancing herself from any sources of food that may attract a bear's attention, she could spend the rest of her night enjoying herself out in the open as she always liked. Leia scoured her tent for any crumbs of food she could find. She put inside a bag everything she thought may attract a grizzly bear's keen sense of smell, including some lentils and dried blueberries, and stored it almost 30 feet away from her tent. Finally, she thought to herself she could sleep in peace and not have to worry. What Leia failed to consider, however, was that the containers she used to store her food prior to the previous bear encounter still reeked of blueberries, something which a grizzly bear's phenomenal sense of smell can easily pinpoint. At around 4 a.m., the Coles were yet again awoken by horrifying noises. Joe realized that the noises were coming from Leia's tent and that she was being attacked, despite not hearing her yell out for help. After exiting their tent, the couple was mortified by what they saw. They quickly pulled out their can of bear spray and rushed towards Leia, unloading on the beast as it pounced up and down on her tent. After it finally had enough, the bear let Leia go and retracted back into the woods. The Coles noticed Leia wasn't moving underneath her now destroyed tent. They ripped the torn tent away from Leia's body and were mortified by what they saw. It was Leia, now sitting motionless and bloodied, her neck and spine contorted in an unsettling fashion as the nearly 500-pound beast had come crashing down on her with all its might, likely causing instantaneous death. After arriving at the scene, investigators found an almost empty can of bear spray that seemed to have been sprayed recently right under her tent. Despite allegedly moving all food away, investigators discovered a small bag of dried blueberries inside her tent, as well as a saddlebag full of food that was likely overlooked by Leia, just outside the entrance of her tent.
In national news, we have disturbing details this morning about a California woman who was killed by a grizzly bear in Montana. Wildlife officials say that the bear pulled her from her tent in the middle of the night and killed her before fellow campers could use bear spray and get the animal to run away.
Investigators theorized that Leia was awoken out of her sleep for the second time that night to the sight of the bear creeping inside her tent. Her sudden movements to grab the bear spray likely caused the bear to swipe at her neck as Leia squeezed the can of bear spray at the bear, unable to talk as the deep bleeding gashes now prevented her from screaming for help. Blinded by the bear spray while half inside Leia's tent, the bear began jumping up and down in attempts to free himself, landing repeatedly on the top of already dying Leia, breaking her bones and killing her. On the 9th of July, 3 days after Leia's death, a 4 to 7-year-old bear was seen breaking into a chicken coop and was shot by officers. DNA analysis from the bear's paws confirmed that it was indeed the one who took Leia's life. The Davis family, who had lost their loved one in this tragic event, were devastated, although hopefully they can find some comfort in knowing that the beast responsible won't be hurting anyone ever again. The tragic loss of Leia Loken at the hands of a grizzly is a reminder of how important it is to be cautious when venturing into areas where these creatures are known to roam. No matter how well prepared you think you are when stepping into wild territory, sometimes there's just no avoiding an encounter with a wild animal. And as the human population continues to grow and expand into areas that were once wild and unexplored, the likelihood of coming face to face with these terrifying creatures continues to rise. In the end, Leah's untimely death serves as a powerful warning to not only always be aware of your surroundings and take the necessary precautions, but to always heed nature's warnings and respect the boundaries of its many dangerous creatures. Otherwise, you might end up in death's cold embrace, your life withering away before your eyes as you're handed your final affliction.